Welcome to the narrated step-by-step tutorial for my painting, Acadia Brook. The photograph on the right was the inspiration for this painting. However, for my interpretation, I made a few adjustments to the composition. While this inlet winds from the foreground into the distance, you can't see it from where I took this photograph. You'll notice where the arrow is pointing that all you see is land. However, this waterway winds all the way out into the distance. So in my interpretation of the scene, I changed the viewpoint slightly so that you can see the waterway as it winds out into the distance. Another adjustment that I decided to make, if you look on the left side, you can see that line of rocks goes all the way off the page. I wanted to be able to show that water flowing out and pull some of the reflections from the landmass on the left. So rather than have that visual barrier, you can see in my composition, I decided to shorten that line of rock so that you could follow the water as it winds out into the distance. One other slight adjustment, if you look in the distance, you'll see that landmass, it's flat and actually in line with the next landmass of a tree line, which is in the distance and creates a tangent. So in my composition, I decided to move that landmass up a little bit and make it a little bit more rounded to make it a little more pronounced and eliminate the tangent that exists in the photograph. I begin with a light pencil sketch using a B pencil. I'm working on 140-pound cold press Lanaquarel watercolor paper. This is a quarter sheet, so the dimensions are 11 inches by 15 inches. I used a variety of colors for this painting: cerulean blue, ultramarine blue, royal blue, peacock blue, which is a staining blue similar to like a phthalo or a Windsor blue, quinacridone coral, Pyrrole red, sap green, raw sienna, burnt sienna, and quinacridone gold. A few of these I use more than others, which I only used a little bit in the painting. Sometimes when I do a landscape like this, I'll use masking to protect some of the whites when I put down a large wash. However, in this painting, I've decided not to do any masking. I'm just going to use direct painting. I've started to apply a sky wash of cerulean blue using a 1-inch flat brush. This is a silver black velvet brush I like to use, and I've started to bring in some raw sienna to the left. I'm working wet on dry, and I'm working at about a 15 to 20 degree angle. My brush is fully loaded, so it's holding all the moisture it can hold, and when I take it to paper, it gives a nice coverage. And I have full control because I'm working at an angle, and gravity is going to pull it down, so I know where it's going to go. And the paint is only going to flow where I've dampened the paper with my brush. The dry paper in the other areas is going to resist the flow of paint, so that helps me preserve the white of the paper. When people start with watercolor, they're often afraid to work at an angle because they feel that it's just going to roll off their page, but that's not the case. It's actually the only way that you can really control it and know where it's going to go, because gravity is going to pull it down, and you know that. But the dry paper will resist the flow of the wet paint to some degree. Well, if you get too much there, it's going to start to drip, but you can see how fluid the wash is I'm putting down. And that paint's only going to go where I wet the paper with my brush, unless I've soaked it beforehand, which I haven't. I'm working wet on dry as I apply this wash. And I've added a little bit of ultramarine blue to my mixture as I brought this down into the water. But I've continued with raw sienna. There's still some cerulean blue in there and a touch of ultramarine blue. And once this wash is completely dry, it's going to be much lighter than what it appears right now. So this is actually a very light wash that I'm applying. And you can see as I brought this wash down, there's many areas where I've saved the whites, and I didn't have to mask, and the paint isn't flowing into the white area because the dry paper will resist the flow of the paint. I do have to be aware, however, where any beads of water might accumulate and pick those up with a damp brush, or they'll eventually cause a backwash. Another thing I'll point out is there's some areas up in the tree lines where that wash came down, and that's fine because those are going to be dark valued areas as I progress in my painting process. I'm going to begin by painting this distant landmass, and I'm using a mixture of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, and the distant shapes that I have in my composition aren't going to be as bright as far as the colors I'm using. I want them to be less intense in the distance. And I'm just applying this wash using a number 4 sable. You could just use a good general purpose brush for a lot of this brush work that I'm doing. And remember, this is one of the changes I made in my composition, because in the photograph, the shape that I'm painting right now was a direct line with the other tree line, creating a tangent. So I made that adjustment and made that up a little higher with a little bit more of a roll to it than in the actual photograph to improve the composition. I'm going to begin to start to paint these tree lines, starting with the most distant one, and I'm using a mixture of sap green with some Pyrrole red in it and some royal blue. The Pyrrole red helps neutralize that green a little bit, and the royal blue helps give me a darker value when I need it. So as I paint this shape, I'm trying to give the suggestion of treetops on the distant tree line there. As I move through my painting process, I'll be painting the tree lines and the land that surrounds them. And I'll be using a variety of colors with frequent color changes. And I can't mix those every time I need a new color. So this is what my palette looks like when I'm painting something like this. On the left side are mixtures of sap green with raw sienna, with a little bit of burnt sienna and some quinacridone coral, and there's just a little bit of ultramarine blue over there. On the right side are some of the same colors, but they're cooler mixtures and often darker valued. But there's sap green, there's ultramarine blue, there's burnt sienna, royal blue, quinacridone coral, and even some raw sienna in there. With these mixtures available, it's very easy for me to change on each time I load my brush with a different color. Here I'm going to continue to paint the shapes that make up the tree lines and the land masses. And as I do, if you can envision my palette, you can see how easy it is for me to change colors. I'm not going to paint these just one flat tone. As I move through the process here, I'm going to periodically change the color that I'm loading on my brush as I apply a wash. And you can see by my palette how easy it is for me to change at will the color that I'm loading my brush with. You'll hear me refer to these distant tree lines as shapes, because when trees are in the distance, they lose their characteristic of being an individual tree, and they take on a different character, that of the tree line or the mass of trees, and they become one big shape. Here I've switched the brush that I'm using to a quill brush that I like to use when I'm doing some detail or need a fine point. This brush has a nice sharp point, but it holds quite a bit of paint. I've also, as I've been progressing, I've changed the colors up a little bit. It's hard to see in the video, but the mixture I'm putting down right now is a little bit lighter than what I had at the start of this shape. And I'm also going to bring a little bit of a red tone in here just to give some variety to this wash. I don't want it just to be, as I said, one flat wash. So this mixture has a little bit of quinacridone coral in it that I've added to this wash. So as I've come across and applied the wash to the shape that I'm painting right now, I started with a mixture of sap green with royal blue, a little Pyrrole red, and it's kind of a little bit of a cool tone. But I brought in some areas towards the tops where some sunlight could be capturing, hitting the tops of those trees. That's just a little bit warmer. And now I'm back to a cooler mixture that gets into the base of these trees, into the back of these trees. But I have changed the colors as I've moved through this one shape that I'm painting. I'm going to begin working on the left side here of this grouping of trees, and if you look in the photograph, you'll see there's an individual tree that's kind of out on that landmass by itself, and so that's what I'm putting in right here. I'm using just a dark value mixture of sap green, Pyrrole red, and royal blue, and just painting that tree that's out there on the point. Now I'm going to move in using the same mixtures and paint this tree line here to the left. And this tree line in space is about the same location distance wise as what I've painted on the right. So they're very similar in value and actually color. You can start to see the difference between the foreground, the middle ground, and the background. And value will play a role in that. I'm going to begin to start to paint some of the ground cover that surrounds the tree lines here and is in between them. And these are going to be using a warmer mixture of raw sienna with some sap green in them, some quinacridone and coral. And because of how my palette was, you saw, I don't have to stop and mix a bunch of colors because I still have that rainbow of colors, that variety of tones available to me on my palette that I can load my brush up with at any moment. So that's what I'm doing. I'm using some of those warmer mixtures that were on the left side of my palette as I start to put down a wash that has more of a raw sienna, sap green feel to it. I'm going to begin to work on this last tree line, which is actually the closest tree line in the composition. It's nearest to the foreground, although it's still pretty much middle ground. But I need to differentiate it from the other tree line so it doesn't feel so flat and has a little bit of depth to it. So I'm using a lighter value and a warmer tone to help make that distinction. And you can see as I paint this that once again I'm treating this as one big shape. I'm not rendering individual trees here as I paint this. Here again I'm drawing from the left side of my palette with a very warm mixture of raw sienna with some quinacridone and coral in it to give that warm tone on the ground. I'm going to take a mixture with some sap green and gradate that into this other mixture, this warmer mixture. And having all those tones available on my palette allows me to do this quickly, and I can get a nice transition from one color to the next that if I had to stop and mix colors every time I wouldn't be able to do because the paint would start to set up and start to create hard edges. I'm working on the left side now with similar mixtures and giving the indication of this landmass. So same colors, raw sienna, quinacridone coral, sap green, and I have put a touch of royal blue in for a darker value. You'll notice as I paint this shape that makes up this piece of land that's sticking out into the water here, that I'm letting the shape of the rock that is in this piece of land that's more in the foreground, I'm letting that piece of rock break the line of the other landmass here because I don't want to touch right on it and create a tangent. I want it to go past the shoreline there and break into the shape a little bit. Just the overlap I think creates some depth, but the eye can still follow the water all the way out into the distance. I'm going to begin to paint this piece of land that's more in the foreground here, and it's going to be much warmer than the other areas I've painted. And for this mixture, I'm using raw sienna, but I've also have a touch of quinacridone gold to give it a little bit of a brighter gold tone than I can achieve with the raw sienna. That bright tone is going to help to define its location in space. I haven't used those brighter tones as you've moved back in the composition. So value and color can help you define where something's at. These are the things that help create depth in the composition. But this brighter color says I'm in the foreground, and those other areas of the land are further back. They're not as bright, they're not as intense. I'm going to finish filling the shape in with tone, and it's still very wet. And I want to give a suggestion that this is a grassy piece of land. So while it's still wet, I'm taking the broadside of the scraping tool and giving the suggestion of grass. So it's creating texture and direction. It's giving some verticality to this. So when you scrape or when you use a brush stroke, always be aware of the direction and the important role that can play. Now, if I were trying to scrape individual blades of grass or branches at this point, I'd probably wait a little longer till it was damp, not as wet. But I'm moving larger areas and larger scrape shapes to give the suggestion of this grassland. Something else to keep in mind as I move on to paint some of these rocks is that texture that I created to give the suggestion of that grass gives a level of detail to that area that the other land masses don't have. It's just another element that helps define where it's at in space, because you have more detail in this area, which is more in the foreground than the other areas that are similar, but they're distant. So I'm painting these rocks using mixtures of ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, some royal blue. At times I'll put some quinacridone coral in there, or some raw sienna, and even some cerulean blue. Just variations in the ratio of the mixtures to give me some different tones. And as I paint this rock shape with a very dark value, it's very flat wash, but I'm going to give it a little bit of texture by taking the scraping tool, and I'm just going to lightly scrape that area while it's still wet, and not much. It just gives a little bit of variation in the shape there, the wash that I've applied. Continuing to paint the rocks here, similar mixtures, and I'm just doing this with a general purpose brush. I'm using a sable, but you could use a synthetic blend for this type of work. And keep in mind, this is the area where I shortened from the original photograph, where those rocks that were coming off the end of this piece of land. In the photograph, they went off the page, but I've left that open so you can follow that water around this point as it moves into the distance. Using a slightly lighter value mixture on this rock here, where some of the light can be hitting. Still just kind of a gray tone. Then I'm going to come in with a darker value and let that run into the other wash. Gives it a little bit of a softer edge there. Here I've worked my way around, and I've put a pretty dark value on all these rocks. And this area here in the foreground is really where I have some of my strongest contrast, where I have these very dark rock shapes against the light tone in the water. Now I want to give the suggestion of the land reflecting down into the water. So you can see as I do this that I leave just a slight line of light value in between the actual land and the reflection, and that just seems to happen naturally with the reflections, but it gives a nice break and helps the viewer understand that this is more of a reflection than a continuation of the piece of land. And the same as I go around some of these rocks. As I work my way around this area, I'm going to take a spray bottle and just soften that edge up and let it run down to make it feel more like a reflection. I probably could have gotten by without it, but I just like the feeling that it gives to the overall painting. I'm going to give more indication of reflection here, in this case the rocks. I'm using a bit of a burnt sienna tone here that picks up some of the red that I've used in other areas of my composition. And I'm going to move over to some of these other rocks and just give an indication of the reflection. And you can see also that I leave a little bit of a break in most cases between the actual rock itself and the reflection, just to give a little bit of a white highlight there. And I'm going to soften those edges up with a damp brush, and also I'm going to use the spray bottle to soften some of those up. Here I'm continuing with the rocks here, and I'm still softening the edges with the spray bottle, and I just think it gives it a nice watercolor feel. I'm going to strengthen the intensity of the blue tone in the foreground here using a wash of Peacock blue. Peacock blue is a Holbein color, and it's made from two pigments, PB15 and PG7, so it's a blue-green color. A good replacement for this would be a Winsor blue or a phthalo blue. This wash I'm applying is going to increase the intensity of the blue and strengthen the feeling of reflected light in the water. You'll have a nice contrast between the wash I'm applying now and the wash that I put down at the very beginning of my painting process. I'm bringing that wash across the foreground area and leaving some larger areas without the wash, so I have some larger light shapes, and I'm going to take that wash and take touches of it back to the middle ground area, but I'm leaving predominantly lighter shapes there to give that feeling of reflected light on top of that distant area of water. While the wash is still wet, I'm going to take some darker valued greens and just drop them in there to pick up some of the reflection from the trees. I'm going to move over to the left side and do the same to pick up some of the reflection from the landmass and from the trees. There's a rock on this piece of land that I haven't painted yet. This is the one which is breaking the plane of the next piece of land. So I'm painting it with a dark value, and I'm trying to let it kind of feather into the ground there because it's a grassy area. And I'm leaving just a touch of light on the left side of that rock to pick up the reflection of light. I'm going to apply a little bit more to this other rock. I want to give the indication of one more rock on that other side of this piece of land. I'm going to go a little darker with this reflection and carry that right into the rock shape. Take that along the length of this piece of land. I'm going to strengthen on this right side a little bit more. I want to strengthen the shadow areas of a few of these rocks using a darker value. And I'm going to do it in such a way that it helps give more suggestion to the feeling of water and the ripples and the reflection of the water. Doesn't take a lot, just a few touches of a dark value, just to suggest a little bit more reflection in this area. I want to emphasize a few of these areas where it's reflecting the trees a little bit more with just a little darker value, but not a lot of it. I want to work a little bit more on this area here as far as the reflections, so I put that sap green mixture in there, and then take the fine mist sprayer to soften these edges up. I mean, a little bit of that over here also. I'm going to come back in with another layer of a blue wash, using once again the Peacock blue. Just building a little bit of a darker value in a few areas on top of the wash I already have. I'm going to soften some of the edges on this this layer of a wash, just as I did on some of the reflections coming off the rocks. So it's consistent with the feel of the washes that I've already put here to the reflections. I'm going to put some touches of this color here, and then once again I'm going to take the fine mist spray bottle. I'm just going to spray it and draw it down a little bit to give that feeling of water. Now I'm going to come in and do some final brush work using the quill brush that I like to use. You'll often see me using this brush towards the end of my process. And I've got a dark value of royal blue with some burnt sienna in it. And I'm just putting some small brush marks. You'll often see me do this in my paintings, where towards the end I come in, I do some brush work just to add some detail, and I use it to define shapes or edges that I feel need a little bit more definition or need reinforced, or I'll put some dark marks in areas where I want to strengthen the contrast and bring attention. I want a darker shape here on the edge of this front landmass. This is another variation from the distant shapes that I've painted, where it's closer to you and has more definition, more detail to it. And this again is another element which helps say that this piece is in the foreground while others are in the middle ground or background. I'm going to take that value all the way out to the point of this piece of land so that it's consistent with the rest of this shape. These touches of darker value that I'm making right now are all just a dark mixture of royal blue, burnt sienna, with a little sap green mixed in. And I'm going to take some of that value and just give a few touches to this middle ground piece of land here. So just give the indication that there's a shore and a bank there, but not with any level of detail, so it's not competing with what's going on here in the foreground. And just a few touches a little further back. This is often something I do at the end of my painting process, and it helps tie the piece together and gives emphasis where I feel it's needed. I hope you saw throughout this painting process how I tried to put an emphasis on trying to establish a foreground, a middle ground, and a background, and create the feeling of depth. I'm going to put a white mat on this so you can get a good look at it. That's my painting, Acadia Brook. Thanks for watching. If you haven't already, be sure to check out Rick Sort's Watercolor Friends and Subscribers on Facebook. And if you ever have questions about my materials, you can go to the studio page of my website where I have an extensive listing of my supplies. And if you have any questions, you can always email me at contactrsorwitzart@gmail.com. Thanks for watching.